There are legends whose greatness is measured by trophies, headlines, and the echo of applause. Yet Richard Burton existed in a realm far more complicated than the image the world adored. To millions, he was the embodiment of masculine grace, a face sculpted for the camera, a voice that seemed to vibrate through marble, a presence so commanding it reshaped every room he entered. But behind that brilliance lived a truth he carried like a weight beneath his ribs, a truth that no studio, no lover, and no audience was ever meant to witness. Because Richard Burton loved a man, and he believed that speaking this aloud would destroy everything that kept him standing. That secret, held in the quiet chambers of his heart, became the invisible force guiding him through triumphs and disasters alike. It shadows every chapter of his story and raises the questions no biography has ever dared linger on. When did this forbidden feeling first ignite inside him? How deeply did it influence the choices he made, the roles he accepted, the addictions he fed, the relationships he clung to and ultimately shattered? And why, even when he stood at the height of fame, did he feel compelled to bury this truth so completely that not even Elizabeth Taylor, the great love of his life, could reach it? Fragments of that hidden life still survive in whispers. A photograph said to have been seized and destroyed by MGM. A diary page torn away except for one chilling line. And, locked away in private hands, a recording where Burton confesses, with a voice stripped of grandeur, "I was two men, and only one of them was allowed to live." This is the story Hollywood never dared to tell, the story of the love that shaped him, wounded him, and refused to die. Richard Burton's story did not begin in the spotlight, but in the soot-stained valleys of Wales, where hardship was not episodic but constant, and where a young boy learned early that survival depended on silence. Born into a family of 13 children, with a father whose drinking could turn from affectionate to violent without warning, and a mother who died before he could form a single lasting memory of her, Burton carried into adulthood a wound that never quite closed. The absence of safety became the backdrop of his earliest years, shaping a boy who longed not merely to succeed, but to be seen, understood, and held. Longings he would spend a lifetime trying to satisfy on stages and screens across the world. He possessed gifts that seemed almost mythic, a photographic memory, an instinctive grasp of emotional nuance, and a voice that directors would later describe as a cathedral built of thunder and velvet. These qualities drew him to the theater, where for the first time he discovered a place where intensity was not punished but revered. Under the mentorship of Philip Burton, who would eventually give him not only guidance but his own surname, Richard began to rise with a velocity that startled even him. Shakespearean roles became his sanctuary, and soon the young Welsh miner's son was being heralded as the future of British acting. Yet with every ascent came a new layer of performance, not on stage, but in life. Hollywood, when it came calling, demanded not merely talent, but transformation. It wanted Burton to become an emblem of masculine perfection, stoic, seductive, invulnerable. The studio sculpted his public image with the same precision they used to shape careers across the Golden Age. But with Burton, the process felt almost cruel. The world adored the myth they built around him, yet behind that facade stood a man still haunted by a childhood that had taught him to fear tenderness, to guard his innermost feelings, and to internalize the belief that vulnerability was a liability. As Burton rose through the ranks of global stardom, delivering seismic performances in Hamlet, Cleopatra, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, and Beckett, the distance between the public icon and the private man widened. Awards followed, fortunes amassed, scandals erupted, but none of these altered the essential truth he carried within him, that the qualities the world praised were the very things that trapped him. The deeper his fame grew, the stronger the need became to conceal the parts of his identity that did not match the myth. And in the rigid landscape of mid-century Hollywood, where a whisper of same-sex affection could end a career overnight, this concealment felt less like a choice and more like an inevitability. Burton learned to wear masculinity as armor, a necessary performance that shielded a heart far more fragile than the world would ever believe. Even as he stood across from Elizabeth Taylor, sparring, laughing, imploding, and loving with a ferocity that still echoes through Hollywood lore, there remained a sense of incompleteness, a subtle fracture beneath the grandeur. Behind the public roles, the awards, the adoration, another story waited in the wings. The story of the man he loved, the truth he buried, and the inner self he never allowed the world to meet. And it is only by understanding the legend he was forced to become that we can begin to see the secret he spent a lifetime hiding. Long before Hollywood sculpted Richard Burton into its ideal of masculine perfection, there was a different chapter to his life, one written far from cameras and audiences, in the quiet corridors of British theatre. It was there, surrounded by rehearsals that stretched past midnight and scripts worn soft from study, that Burton encountered the man who would awaken a part of him he had long suppressed without even knowing it. Their bond began with small gestures, shared cigarettes during intermissions, whispered conversations about art, life, and loneliness, and slowly deepened into a companionship that neither of them had the language to define in an era where such feelings existed in the shadows. The man, older and possessed of a gentleness Richard had rarely known, offered something more profound than admiration. He offered understanding. He listened without judgment, spoke without raising his voice, and looked at Burton not with envy or awe, but with clarity, as if he could see beyond the armor the young actor was already learning to wear. For someone raised in a world where affection was scarce and emotional closeness felt dangerous, this quiet intimacy was transformative. It unsettled Burton, yet it drew him in with the force of something inevitable. Their connection intensified during a brief hiatus from work, when, away from the demands of the stage, they decided to disappear for a few days into the remote highlands of Scotland. Burton would later describe this trip, never publicly, only in the privacy of letters never sent, as 3 days suspended from reality. They wandered through mist-covered hills, read poetry aloud beside cold streams, and shared long silences that felt more honest than any conversation Richard had ever held. It was during this escape, cocooned from the expectations of the world, that Burton confronted a truth he had spent years avoiding. He felt complete with this man in a way he had never felt with anyone. In one moment, sitting beside a fire that crackled against the Scottish wind, Burton wrote a line in his notebook, a line he would later tear out but never forget. "I have never felt freer, yet never been so terrified of myself." The fear came not from the man beside him, but from what the presence of that man revealed. Richard Burton, the rising Shakespearean star, the pride of British theatre, felt something deeper than friendship, something tender and electric and utterly forbidden. When they returned to London, the spell broke as quickly as it had formed. Theaters demanded his presence, agents arranged meetings, and critics began whispering that Burton was destined for international fame. In the face of this mounting pressure, he did what he had always done when confronted with something vulnerable. He folded it inward, hiding it beneath layers of charm, wit, and performance. But the memory of those 3 days in Scotland did not fade. Instead, it carved itself into him, a quiet ache he would carry for the rest of his life, resurfacing in the most unexpected moments. In the warmth of applause, he would recall the peaceful silence of the Highlands. In the intensity of romantic scenes on stage, he would think of the first time he had felt desired without being possessed. And as Hollywood prepared to remake him in its own image, the young Welsh actor knew that he had already lived his most honest moments, in the presence of a man whose name he would never dare speak aloud. When Richard Burton stepped into Hollywood, he entered a world built on illusions, a place where reality mattered far less than the image the studios crafted, and where the price of deviating from that image could be catastrophic. For an actor who was already becoming synonymous with virility, confidence, and irresistible charm, the mere hint of a same-sex attachment was not simply unwelcome, it was unthinkable. Hollywood's golden age thrived on strict archetypes, and men like Burton were expected to embody a fantasy that allowed no room for vulnerability, contradiction, or forbidden desire. At first, Burton believed he could leave that part of his life behind in Britain. The man he had loved, or nearly loved, had remained in the shadows of theaters and Scottish hillsides as if belonging to a different lifetime altogether. But memory is not so easily severed, and neither is emotion. Even as he stood on grand sets surrounded by Cleopatra's palaces and Elizabeth Taylor's burning violet gaze, something in him remained anchored to a truth he dared not examine too closely. It lingered in the moments between takes, in the silence of dressing rooms, in the way he hesitated when asked about his early years. He lived as if constantly listening for the echo of a self he had banished. Hollywood, however, had a way of uncovering things men wished to hide. The studios monitored their stars with an almost governmental precision. Private investigators, planted gossip columnists, strict morality clauses woven into contracts. MGM, in particular, had a reputation for protecting the marketability of its stars by any means necessary. And when Richard Burton's fame began to ascend dramatically, he became a priority asset. Every interaction, every party, every companion was noted. It was during a promotional event in Los Angeles, a gathering of actors, photographers, and studio executives, that a moment occurred which would haunt Burton for years. A freelance photographer, unaware of the danger of what he was capturing, snapped a candid shot of Burton in a private conversation with the man from his past. The expression on Burton's face was unguarded, softened in a way rarely seen in public, and the gentle proximity between them suggested an intimacy far deeper than camaraderie. To the studio machine, this was not a harmless photograph. It was evidence. MGM moved swiftly. Within hours, executives held emergency meetings, and by morning, the photograph had been confiscated, every known print destroyed, and the photographer coerced into signing a lifelong non-disclosure agreement. Years later, he would describe the image with a trembling voice. They looked like two men who finally found home in each other. For Burton, the incident was a chilling reminder that his private self could be obliterated not just by scandal, but by the machinery of an entire industry. The studio's intervention forced a reckoning he had tried desperately to avoid. He realized that the world he now inhabited had no space for ambiguity, no tolerance for the kind of love that had once softened him. From that moment on, Burton behaved as if constantly watched, because he was. He grew more meticulous about his mannerisms, more cautious about friendships, more determined to embody the version of masculinity Hollywood demanded. And with each passing year, the distance between who he was and who he pretended to be widened, creating a hollow inside him that even fame could not fill. He had learned the rules. This was a love that could never be spoken, never acknowledged, never permitted. And so he buried it, not because he wanted to, but because the world insisted on it, leaving him to live a life shaped by a silence he never chose. Elizabeth Taylor entered Richard Burton's life like a force of nature, brilliant, volatile, tender, and impossible to forget. Their chemistry was immediate and overwhelming, a combustion of intellect, ego, desire, and shared loneliness that ignited the world's fascination and terrified them both. Together, they were magnetic, the kind of couple whose very existence felt mythic, as if they were written by the same hand that shaped Greek tragedies. Yet behind the public drama of their love story lay a more private struggle, one that neither fame nor passion could resolve. To Elizabeth, Burton was a man of extraordinary contradictions, fiercely confident yet quietly wounded, capable of embracing her with the devotion of a poet while withdrawing into himself without warning. She sensed, even early on, that he carried a yearning that had nothing to do with her, a shadow that lingered in his silences, in the way he avoided speaking about certain chapters of his youth, in the sudden melancholy that overtook him after nights of drinking or triumph. She loved him not despite these complexities, but because of them, believing she could reach him where others could not. But there were places within him she would never enter. As their marriage deepened, Elizabeth began to see the cracks in the carefully constructed persona Burton had spent years perfecting. She noticed, too, the intensity with which he reacted when certain names surfaced, or how his eyes softened when memories from before Hollywood slipped into conversations. Burton tried to bury the past beneath the heat of their affection, but the harder he tried, the more violently it resurfaced. Love, even theirs, even that enormous, operatic love, could not mend the fracture between the man he was expected to be and the man he truly was. One night, during a rare moment of honesty between them, that fracture surfaced with a force neither could ignore. They had been fighting, one of those long, weary arguments born not from anger, but from exhaustion, from the weight of trying to hold together something so powerful it kept breaking under its own intensity. As the shouting faded and silence settled, Elizabeth looked at Burton with a tremor in her voice and asked a question she had carried for years but never dared speak. "Is there someone else? Someone he?" The world would remember Elizabeth Taylor for many things, her beauty, her fierceness, her legend, but few would ever know how deeply she understood the man beside her. That question was not an accusation, nor was it jealousy. It was recognition, a quiet acknowledgement of something she had sensed in him, something fragile and unspoken. Burton froze. The room seemed to shrink around them. He could not answer. His silence, long, trembling, suffocating, was all the confirmation she needed. Elizabeth looked away first, not out of shame, but out of grief, because she realized in that moment that she was not competing with another woman, but with a truth he could not voice. Yet she did not rage, nor did she retreat. She simply touched his hand and whispered, "I only ever wanted all of you." Burton broke, but only on the inside. The mask remained. They continued, as they always did, loving fiercely, fighting fiercely, reconciling fiercely, but something fundamental shifted that night. Elizabeth now understood that there was a chamber in his heart she could never enter, no matter how profoundly they loved. Their story remained legendary, but it was forever incomplete, a masterpiece missing a final brushstroke, a love that was vast but not whole. And for Burton, that unspoken truth would echo long after the applause ended, turning even the brightest moments of his marriage into reminders of the man he could not allow himself to be. As Richard Burton's life advanced into its most turbulent years, the emotional fault lines he had spent decades suppressing began to widen. Fame intensified the pressure to maintain the facade. Alcohol blurred the boundaries he was terrified to confront, and the relentless demands of Hollywood left him with fewer places to hide. Yet privately, often in the quiet hours before dawn, when the world was asleep and the armor of performance could momentarily fall away, Burton allowed himself to speak in the only way he felt safe, through the written word. He wrote letters compulsively. Some were addressed to friends, some to Elizabeth, and some to no one at all. But among the dozens scattered across his life, a select few carried the weight of a confession he never dared to articulate openly. One such letter, found years later inside the locked safe of a private collector, has become the most haunting artifact of Burton's hidden life. It was penned in his unmistakably elegant handwriting, folded twice, and sealed but never mailed. Its recipient was unnamed, and its message devastating in its simplicity. For the man I could never name. The letter itself was brief, barely a page, but every line suggested a longing that had endured far beyond their brief time together. Burton wrote of a summer that divided his life into before and after, of a presence that had stayed with him longer than any applause, and of a truth he wished he could have embraced with the same bravery he showed on stage. One line, written near the bottom, stood out with the clarity of a confession whispered in darkness. "I loved you quietly, and perhaps that was my greatest cowardice." But the letter was only one piece of the emotional mosaic Burton left behind. Equally poignant was a single torn page from his diary, its edges uneven as if ripped in haste or fear. The surviving fragment contained just one sentence, but its depth was staggering. "He understood me in 3 words, more than the world did in 30 years. No date accompanied the sentence. No context survived. But the intensity of those few words suggested a doorway into a part of Burton's psyche that remained sealed to everyone else. It showed not only affection, but a sense of recognition, a moment when someone had seen him without the filters of fame, expectation, or myth. These records, fragile and incomplete, reveal a man who carried his truth like contraband. Burton could not voice it aloud, not even to those closest to him, because the consequences would have been catastrophic. Hollywood would not have tolerated ambiguity in one of its brightest male stars, and Burton himself feared that the revelation would undo everything he had built. And so he learned to speak only in fragments, a torn page, an unsent letter, a sentence scratched out, then rewritten, a confession drowned in a bottle before it reached the surface. As the years passed, these hidden writings grew more sorrowful. They hinted not simply at nostalgia, but at regret. A regret sharpened by the knowledge that he had chosen silence not because he lacked love, but because he lacked permission. In every letter, every diary line, every scrap of handwriting that survived, one message echoed with increasing clarity, that his greatest performances were not in front of cameras, but in the constant act of pretending. And behind that performance stood a love that refused to die, even as the man who carried it began to fall apart. In the final years of Richard Burton's life, the brilliance that had once illuminated screens across the world began to dim, not because his talent faded, but because the weight of everything he had never said had finally settled upon him. He withdrew gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, choosing smaller roles, fleeing from the harshness of studio lights, and spending more time in quiet places where fame could not follow. What Hollywood perceived as exhaustion was something far more complex. The slow unraveling of a man who had spent decades dividing himself into 2 irreconcilable halves. Those who knew him during these years described a gentler Burton, a man who laughed less loudly, but listened more intently, who drank not out of indulgence, but out of habit, as though alcohol were a mediator between the world he inhabited and the world he longed for. He often spoke in riddles, hinting at regrets he had never shared, circling truths he could barely admit to himself. And although Elizabeth Taylor was no longer his wife, she remained a gravitational force in his life, one of the few people with whom he could share silence without feeling judged. Yet even with her, even in their most vulnerable moments, There was a boundary he never crossed, a truth she sensed but would never fully grasp. Friends recalled evenings when Burton would retreat from gatherings, sitting alone with a cigarette burning between his fingers, staring at nothing as if watching an alternate version of his life unfold in the haze. Sometimes he would speak of roads not taken, of loves unspoken, of a self that had been forced into exile. But when pressed, he always smiled and dismissed his own words as poetic nonsense, unwilling or unable to dismantle the myth he had built around himself. He lived, even then, in deference to an audience that could no longer see him. It was during one of these late-life withdrawals, in a small, rented house far from Hollywood, where stacks of books and unopened bottles lined the rooms, that Burton recorded a final message, one never intended for public release. The tape was found years later among his belongings, unlabeled, almost overlooked. But when played, it revealed a voice stripped of all theatrical grandeur, the raw voice of a man unmasked. On that recording, Burton speaks slowly, his breath weighted by age and resignation, as if choosing each word with the care of someone who knows they may be his last confession. "I was two men," he says, the tremor unmistakable, "and only one of them was allowed to live." The silence that follows is almost unbearable. In that one sentence, Burton compresses decades of secrecy, longing, and grief. The young man in the Scottish Highlands discovering a love he would never again dare claim. The rising star, forced to watch a photograph of his most honest moment be seized and destroyed. The husband who could not answer Elizabeth's question without breaking her heart. The icon who hid behind roles because the world had no script for the truth he carried. What makes the recording so haunting is not merely the revelation it contains, but the quiet acceptance in his voice. It is the sound of a man reckoning with the life he lived and the life he denied himself, acknowledging at last the magnitude of the sacrifice. He does not ask for forgiveness, nor does he express bitterness. He simply states the truth he has buried beneath decades of performance, a truth that outlived him, waiting for someone to finally hear it. In those final moments, Richard Burton ceased being the invincible titan the world had adored and became, at last, the man he truly was. History remembers Richard Burton as a titan, a man carved from brilliance and contradiction, a performer whose voice could command a stage and whose presence could bend a scene to his will. But history, as it often does, remembers only what was visible. It remembers the awards, the headlines, the epic romance with Elizabeth Taylor, the thunderous performances that defined a generation. What it does not remember, what it was never allowed to see, is the quiet truth that shaped him far more deeply than fame ever could. The love he carried in silence and the price he paid for burying it. Behind the legend was a man who divided his heart between duty and desire, between the life he lived and the life he longed for. He performed masculinity as convincingly as any role, not out of pride, but out of necessity, knowing that a single crack in that mask could cost him everything. And so he lived with a secret that shadowed every triumph and every heartbreak, a secret preserved in unsent letters, torn diary pages, vanished photographs, and the whispered confession he left behind on an unmarked tape. Each fragment points to the same truth, that Richard Burton was never just the icon Hollywood worshipped, but also the man Hollywood feared he might be. We cannot rewrite his story, nor undo the silence that defined it. But we can bear witness to the fullness of the man, to the brilliance and the anguish, to the love that sustained him and the world that refused to make room for it. And perhaps in doing so, we honor not only his memory, but the millions of untold stories like his, hidden behind applause. In the end, Burton conquered the world, but the world never allowed him to conquer himself.